Hello everyone and welcome back to Growing with God. Today, I want to answer another question like I usually do on this channel. And that question is, what can animals teach us about righteousness? There are some verses in the Bible that tell us about the way, animals behave and use these actions that animals have to, teach us some lessons. But what are these lessons, you may ask? Well, in this video, I've compiled about 4 of them that I would like to discuss. And I think the first lesson that we can learn from these animals is that they are generally content. When most animals hunt, they hunt for only that day's meal, and they eat what they hunted when they're hungry, and generally only gather the resources that they actually need for survival. But humans, on the other hand, don't really do this, but instead they always want extras. For example, most people in this world don't just desire to have enough to eat and live a comfortable life, but instead desire to be rich and have more than they could ever need. But Jesus Christ said in Matthew chapter 6, verses 25 to 32, that we should take a second look at the contentment of animals and try to implement that way of life into our own lives. However, I must point out that we're not saying it is bad to be rich or that all Christians should be living paycheck to paycheck or something, as the Bible does show us examples of people who God actually blessed with riches, like King Solomon, as we see in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 11 to 14, or even others like Abraham and David and other wealthy people in the Bible, Job as well. So what Jesus is trying to tell us in Matthew chapter 6, verses 25 to 32, is that if we are not very wealthy, we should still be comfortable and love God, because we have what we need. St. Paul said something important in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 8, and most people would dare not to do what he said here. He said, "And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content." However, for most people, it's about the food that they don't have, the clothes that they can't afford, the car that they don't have in the garage, and the house that they don't have, and so on. But the idea is that we should be happy with what we have. But the second lesson that I think us humans can learn from the animals that were mentioned in the scriptures is diligence. What do I mean by this? Well, in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 to 11, we see King Solomon telling us that we should have the kind of diligence that the ants have, of how they, care for their families and are willing to build shelter and have a desire to put in the work that is required to actually live a successful and fulfilling life. However, there are obviously many humans that we may know personally that do not want to do this, and they lack diligence. For example, many people, despite knowing that being hardworking at their job is essential to living a fulfilling life in this world, they still refuse to put in any effort into their work and instead just do the bare minimum, And there are also those who neglect God's work and are not very diligent in God's work because of that same laziness. How does this play out? Well, there are many people who refuse to spread the gospel to those around them and help others become better people towards God because of the same reason of laziness. However, God wants his children to be diligent in both the work that they do for this world and, even more importantly, diligent in God's service. So, for example, if we're in a working environment, we should be hardworking and never lazy, as this is how we will succeed. King Solomon said in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 29, some wise words. He said, "Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings. He shall not stand before mean men." Also, just like ants are willing to provide for their families and stick with them, we as humans should also stick with our families and never abandon them. And on top of that, put in the work to actually raise them in the fear of God to make them children that God will be proud of. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7 says, "And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thy house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up," meaning all the time. But one last lesson I think is important that we can learn from animals is their natural care for those who are below them and under their protection. Take the bear, for example, who, when they have children or cubs, they protect their young ones and always keep them safe. But we see many parents in this world who just couldn't care less about the children that they raised. And St. Paul described these people as without natural affection in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. And the Bible shows us that God really does not like it when parents act like this. We see how God had punished Eli for the same negligence of his kids if we read 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 13. So caring for those who are under you and making sure that they are protected and led under the right path is something that God cares about very much and that we should do. I'll round off with what King Solomon said once again in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6. He said, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." But I think I can stop here on discussing what animals can teach us about righteousness and living better lives in God's eyes. If you have enjoyed this video or learned something, I will appreciate it greatly if you hit those like and subscribe buttons down below, and also to click that notification bell so when we come out with new Growing with God videos, you will never miss out on a single one of them. Have a great day, and we'll see you all in the next one.